Sakamoto has done it again, and even though he's not the director for Metroid Dread, I think his stamp on the game is undeniable. And though Mercury's team do an excellent job here, I don't know how much of this is purely their vision versus Sakamoto's. So given Sakamoto's track record and the fact that he's getting up there in age, our time being able to praise his work is dwindling. So let's just give him this one. Okay, Sakamoto is someone who rarely misses, and even though us diehard Metroid fans will absolutely rip into Other M, I think he learned from that experience, and so now in Dread, we have a game that has cutscenes, but with much more restraint. This allows the game to communicate more direct characterization through the eyes and whatnot, but also plenty through mechanical expression that has been part of the series all along. So with all of that, let's look at Metroid Dread and see what Mercury Steam and Sakamoto have to say. Let's find out what Metroid Dread is about. On the surface, Metroid Dread is a game about being hunted. Samus starts the game off in the position of the prey, which fits in nicely with the feeling invoked by the title, but is also reflected in the gameplay progression and story. To illustrate, this genre generally always has you start off the game at your weakest, and then gaining power as you go.
Whatever caused these changes seems to have stripped you of most abilities. You might call it physical amnesia.
The story has Samus coming down to ZDR, finding a mysterious figure, fighting him, and then eventually being defeated, and then waking up without any of her previous abilities. The rest of the game's events involve her having to work her way through the unknown planet and gaining old power-ups as well as new abilities to defeat the various villains that come up. So these two parts of the game are in harmony. They express the idea of the prey becoming the hunter. The new heavily advertised mechanic of the Emmy reinforced this theme further. You start off having only the option to flee and or hide, but eventually the becoming the hunter aspect comes in, and it's at its most prevalent here, where a large part of overcoming these enemies is not only about the acquisition of power, but also an understanding of the terrain and luring them into places where you can take them out. So each Emmy interaction is essentially a microcosm of the game as a whole. In addition to all of that, the map is also an inversion of normal, where the ship is no longer the starting point, but it's a goal that you must get to in order to escape. Normally, the map is something you build off of, with the path to safety of the ship always clear. But in Dread, you begin in the unknown, in enemy territory, and wishing for the safety of the ship, but not knowing how to get there. Sounds like an absolute slam dunk for that narrative, right? It's just, I can't help but feel like that's not the full picture. For instance, there's a bunch of stuff that feels really odd with that narrative, right? Like, why does getting expansion packs sound like this? The screw attack is also not the final item that you get, and if the game is about becoming the hunter, aka gaining the power to be free from being hunted, then why would the emblem of freedom of movement be devalued in Dread? You also have the ending, which gives you the most powerful suit in series history, but then right at the end it's just removed? Should the Metroid suit not be celebrated with the overwhelming power it offers? Also, the bosses feel a bit off as well. The ones with cutscenes, at least anyway, there's something that's sad about them rather than triumphant, as would normally be the case for boss kills. Also, where are my big anime titties at? Oh god. Look, I'm gonna cancel myself for that one. Thankfully for us, Metroid Dread is a game with a twist, one that beautifully recontextualizes everything that has happened and illuminates that hidden narrative. So, the twist for Metroid Dread is that all of your exploits on ZDR as Samus have been a ruse. Ravenbeak has been giving Samus orders as Adam for the entire game, only to fall apart at the end when he gives the game away by pushing a little bit too hard and not saying, "Any objections, lady?" Just quickly, I love the subtle ways this twist is foreshadowed. So just the fact that this is a game, and this process is also the same as it was in Fusion, automatically gives it a nice cover. However, there are also other visual indicators as well, like the Emmy doors being the same shifting cube stuff as the Atom Sphere, betraying this Atom's true intentions. You also have the fact that doors are sealed and unsealed, which shouldn't be part of Atom's reach if he is just connecting through communications rooms. Alright, now back to the meaning of this twist. What it reveals is that Samus has not been in control this whole time. She was merely a rat in the maze of Ravenbeak's experiment to coax out the Metroid DNA. So the surface narrative of overcoming the state of being the prey and becoming the hunter is actually a smaller part of a broader narrative about autonomy and control. Now, while it is good to talk about this through the lens of those without power, it is nothing without the context of the power that controls them. And as the twist reveals, the one with that overwhelming power is Ravenbeak. Ravenbeak worships at the altar of power. That essence is core to his being and manifests even when corrupted by something else. We see though through our time on ZDR and through the Chozo stories what this leads to, what you have to sacrifice for that mindset. So in broad strokes, Ravenbeak is a classic villain wanting to control the galaxy, but he needs more power in order to achieve that. And literally everything is expendable in the pursuit of that power. Fellow Chozo, fellow Morkan, even who you might consider to be family. None of them mean anything if they get in the way of the acquisition of power. It is a fundamentally dehumanizing and amoral viewpoint, and the events of ZDR make that clearer. Kraid, who is a former ally, is chained up and used as fodder for Samus's development, as are other experiments and creatures of ZDR. Eventually, even the X-parasites are willingly set loose upon the planet because its entire ecosystem, which is probably incredibly important to your long-term plan, none of that matters, and neither does the potential bond of parent and child. Power is everything. It's this that I think makes the bosses a bit sad in Metroid Dread. It's that they lack power, agency. Ravenbeak has full control over their lives, and whether it be experimentation or torture or whatever, they will be subject to his whims. When Samus comes across them and defeats them, there's much less triumph because these creatures weren't in control of their fate, and often in environments or conditions that handicap them in the fight. This sadness is then reflected, after Samus defeats them, with the framing of these shots and her readying up pose slowed down to evoke a more contemplative feel. The next set of bosses are also entirely corrupted, so are also not in control, but they aren't given cutscenes to amp them up, since they all represent essentially the same thing and can be summarized with experiment number Z57, which does get a cutscene, and we're reminded that even in death, and perhaps especially in death, you have a frightening lack of power. This creature probably had no idea what would become of its corpse, how it would just be splayed out, poked and prodded, and then finally controlled like a puppet by beings that are completely indifferent to it. This is an interesting thread because all of the antagonistic forces in Metroid Dread, the Emmy, the X-parasites, and if you really think about it, Ravenbeak, all share that mindset. They are all completely indifferent to what they are doing. The Emmy are robots, and so only carry out orders to collect DNA. The X-parasites just mindlessly infect hosts. They are killers, but it's only in so much as to ensure their own survival. There's no malice there. And the same can be said for Ravenbeak, who treats all creatures, no matter how close they may be to him, essentially the same as if they were objects, things to either be discarded or used to gain more power. From our perspective, this apathy to other life is a little scary, right? And so when Samus goes through a similar progression, the concern, or the dread, if you will, comes from whether or not she will become just as indifferent with her application of power as the Emmy, X-Parasites, or of course, as Ravenbeak. It turns out, though, there is something worse than indifference, and that is hatred. It is essentially this that Ravenbeak is feeding throughout the experiment on ZDR. Every boss battle, every power-up, and especially with the release of the X-Parasites, he is feeding Samus's unconscious hatred for the Morkin. And as her body becomes this battleground between Metroid DNA and Morkin, that hatred begins to manifest and corrupt her. When Samus defeats the second to last Morkin X, the game straight up gives her this pose where it looks like she's holding a heart and then crushing it without remorse. It is straight after this that she gains the final item, the Power Bomb. Oh, I forgot to talk about the items. Okay, let's assume that I've done this on purpose to reflect within this video essay how we go about item collection within the Metroid games themselves by going right up to just before the finale and then going back to collect everything. Yeah? Cool? Cool. In regards to the screw attack not being the final item, I think I've made a fairly solid case for this game being about control, and for those without power, like Samus throughout most of the game, the very point of progression is the acquisition of power. And so the final item is now the Power Bomb. To me, the shifting of items makes that statement, and it lines up perfectly with the overall narrative of the story, which is all about trying to gain control. And it even works with the framework of Ravenbeak's plan of feeding her power level. Additionally, the expansion packs sound so ominous, I suspect, because the more missiles, health, and power bombs you have access to, the more likely you are to just frivolously use that power. The other power-ups are essential for progression, and so are given the regular fanfare. So, while all that feeding of power is happening, the expansion packs consistently give off those ominous vibes. Either as another way to foreshadow that there is something sinister happening behind your progression, a la the twist, or an omen in regards to the concept of pursuing power in the first place. Or perhaps it's both. Or perhaps it's neither. Like, it could just be that it's just used as a separation between the expansion packs and the non-expansion packs, but I kind of like my reading better. I think it just imbues more meaning into the game, and so let's go with that from now on, because it doesn't actually sound that, it kind of doesn't sound that ominous, but to me it does, god damn it. Okay, so with that said, we can now come back to the finale and finish things off. This is where the twist occurs and Ravenbeak spills the beans. We learn that it doesn't really matter if Samus finds out about this or not, because Ravenbeak can clone Samus, and so he is happy to kill her if she doesn't agree to help him. We get the final boss fight of the game, and though Ravenbeak gets the upper hand in the cutscene, his mistake is thinking he can control the hatred in Samus that he has been feeding thus far. But hatred is not something you can control, from either end. Politicians, please take note. God damn it. Even Samus loses all semblance of control herself, so much so that she has manifested a new suit, one that is designed to be completely alien, with its chitinous plating being a stark contrast to the Dread power suit's exposed muscle tissue-y design, which invokes much more of a human and vulnerable feel. Now, the reason why all of this is framed as not good, and technically worse than the indifference of the villains, is that there is nothing gained from hatred. Everything is destroyed. This is expressed within the cutscenes where the Ravenbeak X is completely eradicated rather than absorbed for its powers, but also during the escape sequence where just bumping into enemies will disintegrate them, no Rage Beam required. And really quickly, I want to point out how rad it is that they're using the Hyper Beam in yet another instance of Blind Rage, essentially confirming my reading of its use in Super Metroid. Anyway, the real issue at heart in this ending is that hatred is what we should fear, because it is not only unrivaled in its destructive potential, but it's also something that leads to a loss of autonomy, which will end up hurting your own survival. This is what happens in the ending cinematic, where Samus can't control her absorption powers and will destroy her only means of escape. Luckily for us, Quiet Robe X realizes the existential threat of an unleashed Metroid, at least that's what I think it is thinking, and sacrifices itself to give Samus control. Now, though it doesn't feel like it, this moment here, where she just escapes the planet, is the first time in the entire game where Samus has control. In essence, the game is played to get Samus to this point. That is your reward for beating the game, and so the ending to a run is this. Now, what's really interesting about this move by the devs and by Sakamoto is that it was basically tradition at this point that when you finished a game, you would show more of Samus. How much of her you got to see was determined by how the player played. And so control belongs to us and not to Samus. Functionally, the reward in Dread remains the same as it ever has been. You unlock images. But this time, none of them involves seeing Samus in a more revealing manner, which, fittingly, gives control back to her. In fact, the only time you see Samus in her Zero Suit is when she has totally lost control, when she's dead. And her other, death is less revealing, but I think it hits just as hard on that theme of losing control. What I love about Metroid Dread's narrative is that it isn't as reductive as power is bad. Power is necessary for progression, and when you are prey, you basically need more of it, if only to wrest control over those who would hunt you, or to gain some semblance of autonomy in a hostile world. Without that overwhelming power of hatred, for instance, Samus would not have been able to overcome Ravenbeak. But the game is also not about power being good. Power is just used to explore the underlying fear of losing your autonomy. Samus goes through the arc of being both prey and hunter, and throughout that there is always a fear. Always a force that can take control from you, whether it's an external force like orders or being manipulated, or an internal force like an ideology or an emotion. Control can be lost. Throughout Dread, Samus is never really in control. Other than just being manipulated by Ravenbeak, she is also under the control of the player. And I don't think it's a coincidence that when Samus looks her coolest, when she has the most characterization, is through cutscenes. Now, I know, for your average game, this is basically not saying anything relevant, but it is significant for Metroid. Characterization and emotion has basically always been conveyed through the mechanics, so I think it is actually quite the statement for this game to upturn 35 years of tradition and not only have cutscenes, but also change the completion reward in order to take away just a smidge of the player's power and give it back to Samus. Alright, hold your horses there, buddy, okay? Hello everyone. So, listen, I may have messed up, okay? So that ending sounds very good, except when you take into account, and I didn't realize this at the time, but when you complete the game on normal under I think 4 hours and hard under 4 hours, you unlock all of the those gallery images, and then you get a special new one. That you get when all of them are unlocked, and basically that one, which I'll bring up in a second, has Zero Suit Samus in it, which was super upsetting. So basically, I made this whole video, and then I was like, okay, I need to go back in to get more footage. We can get those later, that's fine. And then I got the footage, and then that thing happened. And I was like, oh, sick! Let's go check out what this new image is. And I opened it, saw that Zero Suit Samus was in it, and then immediately I was like, oh, no. And you can tell in the footage, I was supposed to go over each of the things, and then for the video, was supposed to go over each of the images that you unlocked. But I was basically just stuck on that one. And then I think I might have gone back to a previous thing because it looked the same as another one. And then basically I just quit. I just quit out of the thing in despair because it basically completely ruins my argument and is a direct contradiction to my reading, which is, not great and makes the conclusion pretty garbage. And so that's why I'm doing this right now, is to basically clarify things a little bit for everyone. There's no script, which is why everything is way more rubbish than it normally is. But okay, so me being me, one, I will abandon that position. Basically, it is a direct contradiction. But one thing I will say is that they did make it harder. So in a way, it still sort of kind of works in terms of that giving Samus control and taking a little bit of that away from the player. So that's not really in there, but it is edging towards that idea. And the reason I didn't just scrap this whole video was because, one, I'd done basically all of it, and I wanted to get something done before Christmas. And basically, I just didn't want to, throw that all away. And it is good as an exercise to be able to see all of these patterns in the games. And Mercury's theme could have done that, or Sakamoto, or Mercury's theme. I don't know whose decision these things were. And so if you were to make a game, or whatever, or, ingesting any other kind of art, we follow a similar process of pattern matching and just trying to find patterns and trying to make sense of them, and having, I guess, a reading, and then finding evidence for it, and then trying to find, hopefully, no contradictions. But if you do find the contradictions, then your reading is less valid. I would say that it's not completely invalidating of the whole video. I think 90% of it is still there. It's just that last part that is kind of broken. So yeah, that's a bummer. I also one thing that I didn't realize while I was making the video. There's all the chapters have that little ominous sound bite that I put in to underneath, and they were basically all there because I was like, okay, well, this is part of my reading, and that's what the game is doing, so I will do a similar thing with the video, not expecting to actually have it lead up to something that was bad in the video itself. So yeah, that's a thing that I guess ended up working out, even though my reading of the game is worse. And that's disappointing. It's super disappointing because it's just one image. It's just one image. And it's just made me terribly, terribly upset because it's just one thing, and it's it could have been this very powerful message, this sort of meta fourth wall breaking thing. But it just kind of isn't. It's just not there with that image. So yeah, anyway, so I had to slap this together to get it in before time. So hopefully I can just chuck it in and everything's all good. Anyway, Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.